The worst lies are not the ones you hear. They are the ones you patiently wait to watch come true. My name is Mason Brooks. I am 39 years old, and until that Friday afternoon, I believed trust was something that could survive almost anything. My wife, Claire, had kissed me goodbye before sunrise and told me she was flying to Boston for a 3-day leadership conference. She smiled the same way she always did before business trips, reminded me not to skip dinner while she was away, and promised she would call as soon as she landed. There was nothing unusual about any of it. At least, that was what I wanted to believe. 6 hours later, I stood inside the arrivals terminal at San Diego International Airport, instead of sitting in my office downtown, where everyone assumed I was spending the afternoon. Around me, families waited with balloons, children ran excitedly toward returning parents, business travelers hurried toward the parking garage, and loudspeakers announced arriving flights every few minutes. The entire terminal buzzed with ordinary reunions. Mine was going to be different. I checked my watch again. Flight 428 from Nashville had landed 8 minutes earlier. I knew that because I had purchased a ticket on the exact same route after discovering something I could no longer ignore. I was not there to stop anyone. I was not there to create a scene. I simply wanted to see the truth with my own eyes before making a decision that could change the rest of my life. The automatic doors from baggage claim slid open again, releasing another wave of passengers pulling rolling suitcases across the polished floor. Then I saw her. Claire wore a light beige coat over a navy blouse, her carry-on bag resting easily on one shoulder as she searched the crowd with a hopeful expression I had not seen directed toward me in a very long time. A second later, a man stepped forward from near the coffee stand. Daniel Hayes, her first love, the man she once told me had become nothing more than an old chapter from college. He smiled the moment he recognized her. She smiled back without hesitation. They began walking toward each other, completely unaware that I was standing only a few yards behind him. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Strange how certainty can replace fear in a single moment. Just before they reached one another, I spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. "Did you have a good flight, Claire?" She stopped instantly. Daniel turned around with polite confusion. Claire looked over his shoulder, and the color disappeared from her face. Her suitcase slipped slightly from her hand before she caught it again. No one around us noticed anything unusual. Travelers continued rushing toward the exits. Airport employees pushed empty wheelchairs across the terminal. Somewhere overhead, another arrival was announced. Yet for the three of us, the entire world had suddenly become perfectly still. Looking back now, I realized that was not the moment my marriage ended. It was simply the moment I finally caught up with the truth that had been traveling long before either of us boarded a plane. Claire stood frozen for what felt like an entire minute, even though only a few seconds passed before the flow of travelers gently moved around us again. Daniel glanced from her face to mine, clearly trying to understand why the woman he had been expecting suddenly looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. I offered him a polite nod. He returned it automatically, still believing we were strangers connected only by coincidence. Claire finally found her voice. "Mason, what are you doing here?" she asked quietly. Her words sounded less like a question and more like someone desperately searching for an explanation that would make reality disappear. I looked at her the same way I had looked at her every morning for the past 11 years. Calmly, carefully, without anger. "I thought I would meet you when your flight arrived," I answered. It seemed like the right thing to do. Daniel frowned slightly. "Claire, do you know him?" he asked. Before she could answer, I extended my hand toward him. "Mason Brooks," I said. "Claire's husband." His expression changed immediately, not into guilt, into confusion, genuine confusion. He shook my hand almost automatically before slowly letting it go. Looking back now, I believe that single handshake told me more than any argument ever could. Whatever story Daniel had been told, it was clearly different from the life Claire and I were actually living. None of us spoke for several long moments. Airport announcements echoed through the terminal while luggage wheels rolled across the polished floor and families reunited all around us. The ordinary world continued moving forward as though nothing remarkable had happened. Eventually, Claire suggested we step away from the crowd. We walked toward a quieter seating area near the large windows overlooking the runways. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody attracted attention. I had not come there to embarrass anyone. I had come because I could no longer live with unanswered questions. As we sat down, I found myself remembering the woman I had married. Claire and I met 12 years earlier at a neighborhood charity fundraiser in San Diego. She volunteered at the registration table while I helped organize parking for the event. We spent half the evening talking after everyone else had gone home. She told me she believed relationships only worked when both people chose honesty every single day. I believed her because she lived exactly that way, or at least I thought she did. We built a quiet life together. Weekend hikes along the coast. Sunday breakfasts at the same family-owned cafe. Summer road trips through Northern California. We never chased extravagant dreams. We simply wanted an ordinary life built on mutual respect. Somewhere over the past year, however, that ordinary life had begun slipping away one small moment at a time. Claire became busier at work. Business trips appeared more often. Phone calls ended whenever I entered the room. She smiled at messages she never shared. Looking back, each change seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they quietly became a completely different story. Claire stared down at her hands without speaking. Daniel finally broke the silence. Claire told me you had separated months ago, he said carefully. I looked at him, then at the wedding ring still resting on my left hand. That is interesting, I replied. Because I left home this morning believing I was married. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though every explanation she had prepared during the flight had suddenly lost its meaning. At that moment I realized I was no longer searching for proof. The truth had already arrived, and it was sitting quietly between the three of us inside an airport terminal where every departure eventually becomes someone else's arrival. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at Claire with an expression that was no longer hopeful, but deeply unsettled. He was not staring at a woman secretly meeting an old boyfriend. He was looking at someone whose story had suddenly begun falling apart one sentence at a time. Claire remained silent, her eyes fixed on the polished airport floor as travelers passed by carrying backpacks, business briefcases, and colorful vacation luggage. The sound of rolling suitcases echoed through the terminal while another boarding announcement filled the air above us. It was remarkable how ordinary life continued around people whose entire world had quietly shifted. After several long seconds, Claire finally looked at Daniel. I was going to explain everything, she whispered. He frowned gently. You told me the divorce had already been finalized. She closed her eyes, but offered no answer. Looking back now, I realized I was not the only person discovering a different version of the truth that afternoon. Daniel had apparently built his expectations around promises that never existed outside their conversations. I felt no satisfaction watching his confusion grow. If anything, I recognized the same disbelief I had experienced only a few days earlier. We were standing on opposite sides of the same deception. I took a slow breath before speaking again. I think all of us deserve honesty now, I said calmly. Claire nodded almost automatically, though she still struggled to meet either of our eyes. She explained that several months earlier she had reconnected with Daniel after receiving a message through social media. At first they exchanged holiday greetings, then memories from college, then long conversations late at night while I believed she was answering work emails. She insisted that meeting him had started as an attempt to find closure with someone she once cared about deeply. Somewhere along the way, however, those conversations became something she could no longer explain to herself, let alone to me. As she spoke, memories I had ignored for months quietly rearranged themselves inside my mind. The evenings she smiled at her phone before placing it face down beside her plate. The business trips that seemed to appear with unusual frequency. The moments she drifted into silence while staring through the living room window, as though part of her attention already belonged somewhere else. None of those moments had seemed important on their own. Together they formed a pattern I had simply refused to recognize. Daniel listened carefully before asking one question that changed the entire conversation. Did your husband know anything about me before today? Claire hesitated. Then she slowly shook her head. I answered before she could speak again. Not until last week. Both of them looked toward me. I accidentally saw a confirmation email for a flight while using our home computer, I explained. The destination did not match the conference you told me about. That was the first time I realized something no longer made sense. Claire covered her face briefly with both hands. I should have told you, she said softly. Yes, I replied without raising my voice. You should have. Another silence settled between us, heavier than the last. Outside the terminal windows, another aircraft lifted into the bright California sky, climbing steadily above the coastline until it disappeared into the distance. I watched it for a moment and found myself wondering how many people on board believed they were flying toward a better future, never realizing the hardest part of their journey would begin after they landed. At that moment, I still did not know what I was going to do next, but one thing had become painfully clear. The conversation inside that airport was not the ending of our story. It was only the first honest chapter any of us had experienced in a very long time. We remained in that quiet corner of the terminal for several more minutes, yet it felt as though an entire chapter of my life had already passed. Claire finally looked at me with tired eyes and asked whether we could talk somewhere private after leaving the airport. I nodded once. There was no reason to continue the conversation surrounded by strangers collecting luggage and searching for rental cars. Daniel was the first to stand. He picked up the small duffel bag resting beside his chair and took a slow breath before looking at both of us. "I would not have come here if I had known the truth," he said sincerely. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment. Looking back, I believed him. During the past hour, I had watched his confidence disappear for the same reason mine had. He had trusted a version of reality that never actually existed. Claire quietly apologized to him. He accepted the apology with a brief nod, wished us both the best despite everything that had happened, and walked toward the airport exit without looking back again. I watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd, realizing that the person I had imagined as the villain in my mind for days had turned out to be another human being trying to understand the same confusion that now surrounded all three of us. Claire and I walked through the parking garage in complete silence. The sound of rolling luggage had been replaced by distant traffic, echoing footsteps, and airplanes climbing into the bright California sky. She reached for the passenger door of my truck, but hesitated before opening it. "Thank you for not embarrassing me in there," she said quietly. I started the engine before answering. "I was never interested in embarrassing you," I replied. "I only wanted the truth." The drive home lasted nearly 30 minutes, yet neither of us spoke more than a few words. The familiar highways through San Diego looked exactly the same as they had every other weekend. Palm trees lined the streets. Cyclists rode along the waterfront. Families gathered in neighborhood parks beneath clear blue skies. It struck me how ordinary the city remained while my understanding of my own marriage had changed completely in less than one afternoon. As we pulled into our driveway, I remembered another day nearly 11 years earlier when we had parked in the exact same spot after bringing home the keys to our first house. Claire had laughed as we struggled to carry too many moving boxes through the front door at once. We had stood together in the empty living room imagining birthday celebrations, holiday dinners, and decades of ordinary happiness. Those memories still existed. They had simply become memories instead of promises. Inside the house, Claire placed her suitcase beside the staircase but made no attempt to unpack. She stood in the kitchen with both hands resting lightly on the counter before finally speaking. "I know you probably think every business trip was a lie," she said softly. "It was not. Most of them were exactly what I told you they were." I listened without interrupting. "Then why hide this one?" I asked. She looked toward the backyard through the kitchen window. "Because I knew if I told you I wanted to see Daniel, you would ask questions I was afraid to answer honestly." Her words settled over the room with painful simplicity. Fear had not created the deception. It had only encouraged it to grow. Looking back now, I realized that relationships rarely collapse because of a single decision. They slowly weaken each time honesty is postponed until eventually the distance becomes too great for either person to cross. Standing there in the quiet kitchen of the home we had built together, I understood that the hardest conversation of my life had not happened inside the airport terminal. It was only beginning now. Claire remained standing by the kitchen window long after the sun disappeared behind the neighboring houses. The room slowly grew darker until the only light came from the small pendant lamps above the island. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. 11 years of marriage deserved more than a conversation driven by anger. It deserved honesty, even if honesty arrived far too late. I poured 2 glasses of water and placed one in front of her before sitting across the table. She wrapped both hands around the glass without taking a sip. Her wedding ring reflected the warm light every time her fingers moved, and I found myself wondering how something so familiar could suddenly feel so distant. Tell me everything, I said quietly. Not because I want to argue, because I need to understand what happened. Claire nodded slowly. She explained that nearly 8 months earlier Daniel had reached out after discovering an old college photograph while helping his parents clean their attic. Their first conversation lasted only a few minutes. Then another message arrived a week later. Soon they were exchanging stories about careers, families, and the people they had become since graduation. According to her, those conversations made her remember a version of herself she believed she had lost somewhere between deadlines, mortgage payments, and everyday responsibilities. She admitted that she never intended for the friendship to become a secret, but once she realized how often she looked forward to hearing from him, she became afraid of what the truth might reveal about her own feelings. Looking back, I recognized something important. The problem had not begun when she booked the flight. It had begun the first time she decided honesty could wait until tomorrow. Did you ever plan to leave our marriage? I asked. Claire answered immediately. No. There was no hesitation in her voice. Then why buy the ticket? She lowered her eyes toward the table. Because I convinced myself I needed closure. I kept telling myself that if I saw him one last time, I could finally put the past behind me. She paused before continuing. Instead, I made the worst decision of my life. I listened carefully, searching less for excuses than for consistency. The strange thing about truth is that it rarely arrives all at once. It comes one careful sentence at a time, forcing you to rebuild your understanding piece by piece. I remembered the confirmation email that had appeared on our shared home computer the previous week. Claire had forgotten to log out before leaving for work. I had not been searching for anything suspicious. I simply needed to print an insurance form when the airline itinerary appeared on the screen. Nashville, not Boston. At first I assumed it was a mistake. Then I searched the conference website she had mentioned. The event was real, but it had ended 2 days earlier in another city. That was the moment I stopped explaining away every inconsistency. I quietly purchased a seat on the next available flight, determined that whatever happened next would be based on facts rather than assumptions. Claire looked at me with tears gathering in her eyes. You never called me, she whispered. I shook my head gently, because I already knew that if I asked questions before I understood the truth, I would only hear the answers you thought I wanted. Another long silence settled over the kitchen. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees lining our backyard. Inside, everything we had built together seemed suspended between the life we once imagined and the reality now sitting across the table. For the first time since that afternoon at the airport, I realized this conversation was no longer about Daniel. It was about whether trust, once quietly abandoned, could ever truly find its way back home. Neither of us slept much that night. Around midnight, I found myself sitting alone on the back patio, listening to the quiet hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves moving through the trees. The house behind me was completely still. Claire had gone upstairs hours earlier, yet I knew she was probably lying awake just as I was, replaying every decision that had brought us to this point. Looking back, I realized that pain does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it settles into a home so quietly that you only recognize it after everything familiar begins feeling different. Early the next morning I left for work before sunrise, following the same routine I had followed for years. I stopped at the same coffee shop on the corner, ordered the same black coffee, and drove the same route into downtown San Diego. My coworkers greeted me with their usual smiles, completely unaware that my personal life had changed forever over the weekend. I answered emails, attended a budget meeting, and reviewed several client proposals. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, however, every ordinary moment reminded me that the future I had imagined no longer existed in quite the same way. Around lunchtime, my phone vibrated. Claire had sent a simple message asking whether we could continue talking that evening. I looked at the screen for several seconds before replying with one word. Yes. There was no anger left in that answer. Only the understanding that unfinished conversations rarely disappear on their own. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected call from an unfamiliar number. The man on the other end introduced himself as Daniel. His voice sounded calm, almost hesitant. He apologized for interrupting my workday and asked whether I had a few minutes to talk. I stepped outside the office building and found a quiet bench overlooking the harbor before answering that I did. Daniel explained that after leaving the airport he had canceled the plans he and Claire had discussed weeks earlier. He told me he had already sent her a message saying they should not speak again because their friendship had been built on incomplete truths. I cannot change what already happened, he said, but I do not want to become another reason your life becomes harder. I thanked him for calling. There was nothing else either of us needed to say. When the conversation ended, I sat there watching sailboats drift slowly across the bay. It occurred to me that closure sometimes arrives from the people you least expect rather than the ones you have known the longest. That evening, Claire was waiting in the kitchen when I returned home. She had prepared dinner, but neither of us showed much interest in eating. Instead, we carried our plates to the dining table and allowed the silence to settle naturally before speaking again. I told her about Daniel's phone call. She lowered her eyes and quietly admitted she had received the same message only an hour earlier. "It is over," she said softly. I believed her. For the first time since the airport, I believed every word she spoke. Strangely, that realization did not erase the distance between us. It simply made the situation clearer. Trust is not rebuilt the moment the truth finally appears. It begins much later, after every hidden door has already been opened. I looked around the dining room we had painted together years before, at the family photographs lining the shelves, and the vacation souvenirs collected from happier seasons of our marriage. None of those memories had become false. They remained real because we had truly lived them. Yet memories alone could not answer the question quietly waiting between us now. The hardest part was no longer discovering what had happened. The hardest part would be deciding whether the life we once built together still had enough truth left to build anything new. The following Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after everything changed, Claire and I sat across from a licensed marriage counselor in a quiet office overlooking Mission Bay. Neither of us had made promises on the drive there. We agreed only that we owed ourselves one honest conversation guided by someone who had no reason to choose sides. The counselor listened carefully while each of us described the past several months. I explained how trust had slowly disappeared beneath unanswered questions. Claire admitted that instead of confronting the growing dissatisfaction she felt within herself, she escaped into conversations that seemed easier because they carried no responsibilities. The counselor asked a question neither of us expected. When was the last time the two of you truly talked without discussing work, schedules, bills, or responsibilities? Claire looked toward the window. I searched my memory. Neither of us answered immediately because neither of us honestly knew. Looking back, I realized relationships rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they become quieter day after day until silence begins replacing connection. Over the next 2 weeks, we attended 2 more sessions. Claire answered every difficult question without avoiding responsibility. She showed me every message she had exchanged with Daniel after reconnecting, not because I demanded access to her phone, but because she believed transparency was the only place trust could possibly begin again. The conversations confirmed what Daniel had already told me. They had planned to meet, hoping to discover whether the feelings they remembered from years earlier still existed. They had not built a hidden life together, but they had crossed emotional boundaries that should never have existed inside a committed marriage. Reading those messages hurt, yet they also removed the last uncertainty from my mind. I no longer wondered whether there were deeper secrets waiting to appear. Everything was finally on the table. One evening after counseling, Claire and I walked slowly along the waterfront near Seaport Village as the sun settled behind the harbor. Sailboats drifted quietly across the bay, while musicians performed for tourists nearby. It reminded me of one of our earliest dates, long before careers and obligations filled every hour of our calendar. Claire stopped beside the railing and looked out over the water. "I keep wishing I could go back and make one different decision," she said softly. I nodded. "So do I." She looked surprised. "What would you change?" I took a long breath before answering. "I would have asked you how you were really doing instead of assuming everything was fine because nothing looked broken." She lowered her head, and for a moment neither of us spoke again. That conversation taught me something I had never fully understood before. Responsibility inside a marriage is rarely identical, but paying attention to one another always belongs to both people. Even so, understanding why something happened does not automatically erase its consequences. During the following week, I met privately with a family law attorney, not because I had already decided to end my marriage, but because I believed important decisions should be made with clear information rather than fear. The attorney explained every legal option available, answered my questions with patience, and encouraged me not to rush toward any conclusion. As I drove home afterward, I realized I finally possessed something I had been missing for months. It was not certainty about my future. It was the quiet confidence that whatever decision came next would be based on truth instead of confusion, and that made all the difference. Another month passed, and life slowly settled into a routine that looked familiar from the outside, but felt completely different on the inside. Claire and I still lived in the same house, shared meals when our schedules allowed, and continued attending counseling together. Friends assumed we were simply busy with work because neither of us spoke about what had happened. We had agreed that whatever decision eventually came would belong to us alone, not to the opinions of people who only knew small pieces of our lives. Looking back, I realized healing is rarely dramatic. It is built through ordinary days filled with difficult choices repeated over and over again. One Thursday evening, our counselor asked each of us to complete a simple exercise. We were told to spend 1 hour separately writing 2 letters. The first letter would describe the marriage we once believed we had. The second would describe the marriage we honestly believed could exist in the future. We were not required to read them aloud unless we wanted to. That assignment stayed with me long after the session ended. When I sat alone in my home office later that night, I filled several pages without stopping. I wrote about trust, quiet mornings, family traditions, shared dreams, and the countless ordinary moments that had once made our life together feel secure. Then I began the second letter. Strangely, the words came much more slowly. I realized I could imagine forgiveness more easily than certainty. Claire handed me her letters the following evening. She insisted I read them privately. In the first, she admitted that she had spent months convincing herself she could manage 2 separate emotional realities without either one colliding with the other. She described how every small lie made the next one easier until honesty itself became something she postponed instead of practiced. In the second letter, she never asked me to forget what had happened. Instead, she wrote that if I chose to walk away, she would understand because trust belongs to the person who gives it, not the person who breaks it. I read those pages twice before placing them back inside the envelope. They did not erase my pain, but they reminded me that genuine accountability sounds very different from excuses. A few days later, I met once again with the family law attorney I had consulted earlier. She reviewed every document we had discussed during our first appointment and asked whether I had reached a decision. I sat quietly for several moments before answering. "Not yet," I said honestly. She smiled with understanding. "Then you are making the right decision," she replied. Permanent choices should never be rushed simply because painful moments feel urgent. Her words stayed with me during the drive home. That evening, Claire was watering flowers in the backyard as the last light of the day faded across the neighborhood. She looked up when I stepped outside, but did not ask where I had been. Instead, she simply handed me the garden hose and smiled faintly. We stood there together in comfortable silence, caring for plants we had planted years earlier when we first moved into the house. It struck me that gardens and relationships share something important. Neglect rarely destroys them overnight. It happens little by little until someone finally notices what has quietly stopped growing. As I watched the water soak into the dry soil, I understood that my decision could no longer be based only on the past. It had to be based on whether I truly believed the future would be built on something stronger than regret. For the first time since that afternoon at the airport, I knew the answer was finally beginning to reveal itself, even if saying it aloud would become the most difficult conversation either of us had ever faced. 3 months later, Claire and I returned to the same counselor's office one final time. We had spent countless hours talking, listening, questioning, and rebuilding conversations that should have happened long before either of us walked into that airport. By then, I no longer carried anger with me. The anger had quietly dissolved into something more useful called clarity. Our counselor asked one last question before ending the session. "What decision allows each of you to live with honesty from this point forward?" Claire answered first. She looked at me with calm eyes and said, "Whatever happens next, I want it to be built on truth instead of fear." Then it was my turn. I took a slow breath before speaking. "I believe people can change," I said. "But I also believe change only matters when it is lived every day, not promised in a single conversation." We left the office without dramatic speeches or impossible expectations. Instead, we made one simple commitment. We would stop trying to return to the marriage we had lost and begin creating a different one, knowing it would require patience, complete transparency, and the willingness to earn trust instead of assuming it existed. The following months were not perfect. There were difficult days when old memories resurfaced unexpectedly. There were moments when a delayed meeting or an unanswered phone call briefly reopened questions I thought had already disappeared. Each time that happened, Claire chose openness instead of defensiveness. She answered every question honestly, shared her schedule without being asked, and understood that rebuilding confidence happens one ordinary day at a time. Slowly, almost quietly, those ordinary days began outweighing the painful ones. Nearly a year after that afternoon at the airport, I found myself standing inside the same terminal waiting for another arriving flight. This time I was holding a small bouquet of white flowers instead of unanswered questions. Claire had traveled to Chicago to speak at a national marketing conference, and for the first time since everything changed, I wanted to surprise her when she came home. As passengers began walking through the arrival doors, I noticed how familiar the scene looked. Families embraced one another. Children waved excitedly. Business travelers hurried toward waiting rides. Life continued exactly as it always had. Then Claire appeared, carrying the same style of rolling suitcase she had brought home a year earlier. The moment she saw me, she stopped, smiled, and walked directly toward me without looking anywhere else. I handed her the flowers, and she laughed softly before wrapping me in a quiet embrace. Neither of us needed to say very much. The airport that had once become the place where our deepest doubts finally surfaced had slowly transformed into a reminder that honesty must arrive before trust ever can. As we walked together toward the parking garage, I realized the most important journey either of us had taken was never the flight across the country. It was the difficult road back toward truth, one honest step at a time. And looking back now, I finally understood that the strongest relationships are not the ones that never face hardship. They are the ones where both people choose, every single day, to stop running from the truth and start walking toward it together.